Valerie Morrison's phone vibrated for the third time that morning. She didn't even need to look to know who it was. Amber had developed a predictable pattern. A photo at 7 in the morning, another at 10, and usually a third during lunchtime. This time, the image showed her husband's mistress wearing the diamond necklace Patrick had supposedly bought for their wedding anniversary 3 months ago. The message was clear and cruel. "Thanks for the gift. He said it looks better on me." Valerie placed the phone back on the desk of her panoramic office on the 42nd floor of the Westbrook building in Chicago. Through the window, the river snaked through downtown like a silver artery, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding in the towers around it. She had built her career brick by brick, case by case, becoming one of the most respected corporate lawyers in the Midwest. At 38, she was a partner at Morrison & Klein, specializing in corporate acquisitions and governance. Ironically, the surname she carried on the office door was his, Patrick Morrison, the man who had promised to love and honor her 12 years ago, in the small church in Evanston where she grew up. The man who now spent 4 nights a week at his 26-year-old assistant's apartment. Valerie's secretary, Ruth, knocked softly on the door before entering with a navy blue folder. "The documents you requested on quantum dynamics," Ruth said, placing the material on the desk. The 60-year-old woman had worked with Valerie for a decade and had developed the skill of reading between the lines of her boss's silence. "And perhaps you'd like to see this too." Ruth slid a tablet across the desk, open to a news item from the Chicago Business Journal. Quantum Dynamics announces gala dinner to celebrate record growth. CEO Patrick Morrison to receive Executive of the Year award. Valerie studied her husband's photo. Patrick, at 42, still retained the charm that had captivated her in law school. Brown hair starting to gray at the temples, a strong jawline, that smile that used to make her heart race. Now, all she felt was a calculated void. "The dinner is Friday, at the Grand Marquis Hotel," Ruth commented, crossing her arms. "Half of Chicago's business elite will be there." "I know." Valerie opened the blue folder and began reviewing the documents. "Quantum Dynamics has been our client for 6 months. I personally structured their latest acquisition." What Ruth didn't know, what no one but Valerie knew, was that during these 6 months she had done much more than just legal advice. She had built a relationship of trust with Marcus Chen, the founder and chairman of the board of Quantum Dynamics. Patrick, as CEO hired 3 years ago, had operational autonomy, but Marcus still held controlling shares and, more importantly, the ultimate power over executive decisions. Valerie had noticed irregularities in the financial reports months ago, small discrepancies that a less trained eye might overlook. Inflated corporate expenses, contracts with questionable suppliers, use of company resources for personal purposes. Nothing that would catch the attention of the internal audit department, which reported directly to Patrick, but enough to raise red flags when examined by someone who knew exactly where to look. And Valerie knew, because she knew Patrick better than he knew himself. She knew his arrogance, his tendency to feel invincible, his belief that the rules didn't apply to him the same way they did to others. She had spent the last 2 months meticulously compiling evidence, every dinner charged to the corporate card when Patrick was with Amber. Every weekend trip to Miami or Las Vegas, classified as business development, but perfectly coinciding with Amber's social media posts. The luxurious apartment in Lincoln Park, rented through an obscure company subsidiary, where his mistress lived without paying a cent. Even more damning were the contracts. Amber worked as a marketing consultant for Quantum Dynamics, a position created specifically for her, with no relevant qualifications on her resume. Her annual salary of $200,000 was approved directly by Patrick, without going through the board or normal hiring processes. "Ruth, I need you to book a table for me at the Grand Marquis, Friday night." The secretary raised her eyebrows. "You're going to the dinner?" As Marcus Chen's guest, he asked me to accompany him as the company's legal representative for recent transactions. In truth, it had been Valerie's idea. During a seemingly routine meeting the previous week, she had casually mentioned the awards dinner and suggested that it would be appropriate to have legal representation present, given the company's exponential growth and the public visibility of the event. Marcus had immediately agreed, without making any connection between the trusted corporate lawyer and the CEO who was to be honored. Patrick had no idea she would be there. In recent months, they had become strangers sharing the same address. He spent as little time as possible at home, usually arriving late and leaving early. Conversations were reduced to the essentials: bills, appointments, the basic upkeep of a matrimonial facade that no longer fooled anyone, except perhaps Patrick's elderly parents, who still believed their son had built a perfect life. Valerie looked again at her phone, where Amber's photo still glowed on the screen. The young woman was conventionally beautiful, with platinum blonde hair, a body sculpted in expensive gyms, nails always perfectly manicured. But what truly defined Amber was her casual cruelty, the way she delighted in rubbing the affair in the betrayed wife's face. The messages had started 6 months ago, first subtle, then increasingly explicit. Photos of the two of them in restaurants, images of expensive gifts, selfies in bed that Valerie recognized as being from the master bedroom of the house she and Patrick had bought together. Her own bed. Each message was a stab, and Amber knew it. Worse, Patrick knew Amber sent the photos and did nothing to stop her. On the rare occasions Valerie brought up the subject, he would shrug, as if her suffering were a mere inconvenience, an excessive sensitivity on her part. "You're overreacting," he had said in their last argument 3 weeks ago. "They're just photos. If they bother you so much, block the number." As if it were that simple, as if the problem were the photos and not the monumental betrayal they represented. Valerie closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the anger that had been carefully suppressed and channeled into something productive. She wasn't the type of woman to make scenes or cry in public. She had been trained to control emotions, to think strategically, to play the long game, and the game was about to end. When she opened her eyes again, her expression was one of absolute calm. Ruth watched with a mix of concern and admiration. "You'll need something special to wear," Ruth said softly. "That's a gala event." Valerie smiled, a small, controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I already have something in mind." The dress had been hanging in her closet for months, still with the tag. Black, elegant, devastatingly sophisticated. She had bought it impulsively after a particularly significant court victory, but had never found the right occasion to wear it. Now, finally, there was. Her phone vibrated once more. Another photo of Amber, this time with a crown emoji, and the message, "See you at his awards. Oops, I forgot. You weren't invited." Valerie typed a reply for the first time in months. "I can't wait." The week dragged on with deliberate slowness, each day measured and precise like the steps of a planned execution. Valerie maintained her usual routine: client meetings, contract reviews, business lunches in discreet restaurants where million-dollar deals were sealed with firm handshakes. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, she counted the hours. Patrick was barely home. On Tuesday, he appeared briefly to change clothes and grab some documents, moving through the house like a ghost haunting its own halls. Valerie was in the kitchen when he passed, talking animatedly on the phone about the awards dinner preparations. "No, darling, the red dress. Definitely. You'll look stunning." He laughed that way Valerie knew so well, the intimate laugh reserved for private moments. It used to be hers. "Yes, our table is the main one, right in front of the stage." He didn't even glance Valerie's way as he went upstairs, as if she were part of the furniture, a fixed and irrelevant element of the domestic landscape. She heard the bedroom door close, the sound of the shower, and 20 minutes later, his footsteps descending again. The front door slammed shut, and silence once again swallowed the house. Valerie took a sip of the coffee that had grown cold in her mug. Her hands were perfectly steady. On Wednesday, Marcus Chen called personally to confirm the dinner details. His voice had that gravelly quality of someone who had smoked expensive cigars for decades, but there was also a sharp intelligence behind every word. "Valerie, I look forward to having you with us on Friday. It will be an important night for quantum dynamics." "The honor is mine, Marcus. Incidentally, I've prepared some documents I'd like to review with you. Nothing urgent, just some corporate governance issues that arose during my quarterly review." There was a brief pause. "Governance issues?" "Routine, for the most part. But there are a few items that deserve your personal attention. Perhaps we could meet briefly before dinner. Say, at 6. I can come to your office." Marcus agreed, and Valerie hung up with a cold smile on her lips. The pieces were moving into their final positions on the board. Amber, predictable as ever, continued with her messages. On Thursday morning, a short video arrived showing her trying on a cherry red dress that probably cost 3 months' salary for an ordinary person. Patrick briefly appeared in the background, adjusting his tie in the mirror, clearly in the apartment the company was paying for. "Tomorrow will be perfect," the message read. "He's finally going to acknowledge me publicly. Everyone will know who really matters in his life." Valerie filed the video along with all the others. Evidence meticulously organized in digital folders with triple passwords, cloud backups, and physical copies in an office safe. She was a lawyer, after all. Documentation was second nature. But the messages had become more than just proof of infidelity. They were a window into Patrick's mindset, his complete disconnection from reality. He truly believed he could publicly parade his mistress at a corporate event, in front of investors, business partners, and Chicago's business elite, without consequences. The arrogance was astounding, and it would be his downfall. On Friday, Valerie woke up at 5 in the morning. The house was silent, the bed beside her empty as it had been most of the week. She made coffee, took a long shower, and chose her outfit with military precision. The black dress would wait. During the day, she had work to do. At 9, she was in her office, reviewing for the last time the documents she would present to Marcus. 53 pages of compiled evidence, each questionable expense highlighted, each irregular transaction explained, each violation of corporate policy documented. Invoices from luxury restaurants on nights Patrick had marked as investor dinners, but which coincided with Amber's social media posts showing identical meals. Records of private flights to vacation destinations charged as business trips. And, most damning of all, the financial trail linking Amber's apartment directly to Quantum Dynamics' operational funds. Ruth entered with a fresh cup of tea. "Are you ready for this?" Valerie looked at her secretary. In 10 years of working together, Ruth had become more than an employee. She was a confidant, an ally, the only person besides Valerie who knew the full extent of the plan. "I've been ready for months." "What if Marcus doesn't react as you expect? What if he decides to protect Patrick?" It was a valid concern. Powerful men often protected each other, closing ranks against scandals that could tarnish collective reputations. But Valerie had bet on something she knew about Marcus Chen through months of close interaction. He was, above all, a man of principles. He had built quantum dynamics from the ground up, transforming a startup in a rented room into a billion-dollar tech corporation. And he had done so without shortcuts, without compromising his integrity. Patrick was just a hired CEO, a professional manager brought in to expand operations. Talented, yes, but replaceable. The company was Marcus's baby, his creation, his legacy, and no one stole from Marcus Chen with impunity. "He'll do the right thing," Valerie said with conviction, "because in the end, this isn't about me or Patrick. It's about his company being used as a personal vault." The following hours passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Valerie operated on autopilot, her mind already at the Grand Marquis Hotel, visualizing every step of the approaching night. At 4 in the afternoon, she released her team early and went home to get ready. The house was empty, as expected. Patrick wouldn't be home before the event. He was probably with Amber, helping her get ready, anticipating the triumph he imagined was to come. Valerie went up to the bedroom, opened the closet, and took the black dress off its hanger. The fabric was Italian silk, cut to accentuate without revealing, sophisticated without being provocative. She put it on slowly, zipped it up the back, and looked at herself in the full-length mirror. The woman who stared back at her was powerful, controlled, lethal in her contained elegance. Valerie pinned her brown hair into a low bun, applied makeup with a precise hand, and chose minimalist jewelry. Pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's, and a Cartier watch she had bought for herself after making partner at the firm. Nothing of Patrick's on her. Nothing he could claim or contaminate with his presence. At 5:40, she was in her car, driving through Chicago's evening traffic towards downtown. The Grand Marquis was one of the city's most prestigious hotels, a restored Art Deco building that hosted high-profile weddings, charity galas, and corporate events for companies wanting to impress. She handed the keys to the valet and entered the opulent lobby, all Italian marble and crystal chandeliers. A private elevator took her to the 20th floor, where Quantum Dynamics maintained an executive suite that Marcus used when he stayed in the city. Marcus's personal assistant received her at the door. "Ms. Morrison, he's waiting." Marcus Chen stood by the panoramic window, watching the city stretch out below him. At 62, he was a compact and intense man, with completely white hair and eyes that missed no detail. He turned when Valerie entered, gesturing towards a meeting table where 2 wine glasses already waited. "Valerie, punctual as ever." "Time is our most valuable resource, Marcus." He smiled slightly and indicated a chair. "You mentioned governance issues that need my attention. Should I be concerned?" Valerie placed her leather brief on the table and removed the carefully organized documentation. "That depends on how seriously you take fiduciary integrity and the appropriate use of corporate resources." Over the next 40 minutes, she methodically guided him through the evidence. Marcus didn't interrupt, merely turned the pages, his expression progressively darkening. Occasionally, he would ask a pointed question, and Valerie would answer with surgical precision, citing specific company policies, federal regulations, and legal precedents. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Marcus slowly closed the folder and looked at Valerie with an expression that was part admiration, part something harder to decipher. "You know Patrick is your husband." It wasn't a question, but Valerie answered anyway. "Yes." "And yet you're bringing this to me." The law makes no distinction based on personal relationships, nor should it. Marcus took a sip of the wine, his eyes never leaving Valerie's face. "How long have you known?" "About the financial irregularities? 4 months? About the mistress he hired with company money?" "A little longer." The founding CEO nodded slowly. "And you waited. Why?" Valerie allowed herself a thin smile. "Because evidence requires context, and context requires time. A questionable expense is a mistake. A pattern of misconduct over months is grounds for immediate dismissal." Marcus stood and walked to the window again, his hands clasped behind his back. Down below, the city lights began to come on against the darkening sky. "Dinner starts in 40 minutes. Patrick expects to receive an award tonight." "I know. He has no idea what's about to happen." "No." Marcus turned, and for the first time, there was something that might have been a smile on his lips. "Then let's give him a night to remember." Tout. The Grand Marquis Ballroom had been transformed into a spectacle of corporate opulence. Round tables covered with champagne-colored linen tablecloths surrounded a dance floor polished like glass. Each centerpiece an elaborate arrangement of white roses and blue hydrangeas illuminated by votive candles. A stage occupied the entire front wall, equipped with giant screens and a sound system that probably cost more than a luxury car. At least 300 people had already arrived. Chicago's business elite in their finest attire, circulating with champagne flutes and animated conversations about mergers, acquisitions, and market projections. Valerie entered the ballroom alongside Marcus Chen, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they moved around the perimeter toward the head table. She could feel the gazes, some people recognizing her as the respected corporate lawyer, others simply admiring her elegant presence. No one had yet made the connection between her and the CEO who was to be honored. The head table was positioned directly in front of the stage, as Patrick had mentioned on the phone. 6 places, marked with name cards in gold calligraphy. Valerie saw her own name next to Marcus's, and 3 places to the right, the cards that would make her heart race if she allowed it. Patrick Morrison and Amber Castellano. They had not yet arrived. "Champagne?" A waiter appeared with a silver tray. Valerie accepted a glass, more to have something to hold than from any desire to drink. She needed to keep her mind absolutely clear. Marcus greeted other executives, introducing Valerie as the lawyer who had structured Quantum Dynamics' most successful acquisitions in recent months. She shook hands, smiled at appropriate moments, participated in superficial conversations about tech trends and market volatility. Her performance was impeccable, years of legal and social training operating on autopilot, while a distant part of her consciousness counted the minutes. It was a collective murmur that alerted her. Heads turning, conversations briefly interrupted, before resuming in lower, more urgent tones. Valerie didn't need to look to know Patrick had arrived. But she looked anyway. He was on the other side of the ballroom, crossing the main entrance as if he owned the place. His tuxedo was impeccable, custom cut to accentuate his broad shoulders, his bow tie perfectly aligned. But it wasn't Patrick who captured the room's attention. Amber clung to his arm like a displayed jewel, the cherry-red dress Valerie had seen in the video now in full glory under the crystal chandeliers. She was dazzling in a deliberately provocative way, the neckline plunging deeper than would be considered appropriate for a corporate event, the side slit revealing a considerable expanse of tanned leg. Her blonde hair fell in Hollywood waves over her bare shoulders, and she laughed loudly at something Patrick had whispered in his ear. The message was unequivocal. They weren't hiding anything. This was a public declaration. Valerie watched as they circulated the room, Patrick greeting colleagues and investors, introducing Amber as his companion without a trace of embarrassment. Some responded with forced cordiality, others with knowing smiles that made Valerie vaguely nauseous. The corporate world, she had learned long ago, often rewarded the same male audacity that it punished in women. Marcus noticed the direction of her gaze. Has he always been this arrogant? Valerie took a sip of champagne, the effervescence lightly burning her throat. Not always. There was a time when he had principles, or perhaps I was simply too young to see beyond the facade. And she knows you're here? Amber. Yes, I replied to her last message. Marcus raised his eyebrows. Bold. She likes games. So, let's play. It was at that moment that Amber looked in their direction. Valerie saw the exact instant recognition hit the younger woman, her blue eyes widening, the champagne flute stopping midway to her red-painted lips. She urgently touched Patrick's arm, whispering something in his ear while discreetly pointing in Valerie's direction. Patrick turned, and Valerie had the satisfaction of seeing the color drain from his face. For a moment, he seemed genuinely shocked, his carefully cultivated composure cracking like glass under pressure. His eyes moved from Valerie to Marcus and back, processing the implication of seeing them together, at the head table, clearly as official guests of the event. Valerie held his gaze across the crowded ballroom, her face a mask of professional calm. Then, very deliberately, she raised her glass in a silent toast in his direction. Patrick said something abrupt to Amber and began walking towards them, his jaw clenched. Amber followed him, her high heels clicking against the marble floor with an urgency that contrasted with her studiously casual body language of moments earlier. Valerie! Patrick's voice was controlled when he reached the table, but there was an undercurrent of barely contained rage. What a surprise to see you here. Patrick. She kept her tone perfectly neutral, professional. Marcus kindly invited me to represent Quantum Dynamics' legal interests tonight. You know Marcus Chen, of course, chairman of the board and founder. Patrick automatically extended his hand, his corporate good manners taking over even as his eyes remained fixed on Valerie. Of course, Marcus, thank you for the opportunity to lead this incredible company. No need to thank me, Marcus replied, shaking his hand briefly. You were hired to do a job. The question is whether you've been doing that job adequately. There was a moment of loaded silence. Amber moved closer to Patrick, her fingers tightening on his arm in a display of territorial possession. Her eyes, Valerie noted, were fixed on her with a mix of defiance and something that might have been nervousness. This is Amber Castellano, Patrick said, his voice regaining some confidence. My marketing consultant. Ah, yes. Marcus looked at Amber with polite interest. $200,000 a year for marketing consultancy. Impressive earnings for someone with 3 years of experience and no relevant specialization. Amber blinked, her smile faltering. I bring a unique perspective to the brand. No doubt. Marcus took a sip of his own champagne, his eyes never leaving her face. Although curiously, I can't find a single report or concrete project you've delivered. Perhaps you can enlighten me about your specific contributions during dinner? Patrick placed a protective hand on Amber's lower back. Marcus, if there are concerns about any team member, perhaps we should discuss them in a more private setting. Oh, we will. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. We most certainly will. A master of ceremonies took to the stage, announcing that dinner would be served shortly and asking guests to find their seats. Patrick hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but the presence of other executives approaching the head table forced him to retreat. I'll see you during dinner, he said stiffly, guiding Amber to their seats across the table. As people settled in, Valerie found herself seated with Marcus to her left, and a vice president of operations she didn't know to her right. Across the table, Patrick was 3 seats to her right, with Amber glued to his side. The distance was enough to avoid direct conversation, but close enough to maintain unavoidable eye contact. Amber wasted no opportunity. She leaned into Patrick constantly, whispering in his ear, laughing loudly at his comments, running her fingers through his hair in gestures of calculated intimacy. It was a performance designed to wound, and for months it would have worked. But tonight, watching the embarrassing display, Valerie felt only a cold detachment. The first courses arrived, an arugula salad with caramelized pear and gorgonzola cheese. Conversations flowed around the table, discussions about artificial intelligence, blockchain, and the next revolution in green technology. Marcus participated easily, but Valerie noticed how he occasionally glanced in Patrick's direction with a thoughtful expression. During the main course, a filet mignon with truffled potatoes and grilled asparagus, Amber got up to go to the restroom. She deliberately passed behind Valerie, stopping briefly to lean in and whisper loud enough for only the 2 of them to hear. "Must hurt, doesn't it? Being here, seeing how happy he is with me. But don't worry, you can still have the house in the divorce. It's the least he can do." Valerie calmly cut a piece of meat, chewed, swallowed. Then she looked up with an expression of polite curiosity. "Tell me, Amber, have you thought about what you'll do when he can no longer pay for your apartment? When the corporate cards are canceled? When you discover that powerful men are only powerful as long as they maintain their positions?" Amber's confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. "He loves me. It's not about money." "Of course not." Valerie returned her attention to her plate. "Have a good night, dear." Amber stood still for another moment, clearly expecting a more dramatic reaction, before continuing on her way toward the restrooms, her hips swaying exaggeratedly. Marcus had observed the exchange with interest. "She really has no idea, does she?" "None." Valerie took a sip of water, her hand perfectly steady. People like that rarely do. They live in bubbles of unearned privilege until the moment the bubble bursts. And Patrick? He must suspect something is wrong, but his arrogance won't allow him to believe there will actually be consequences. Not until it's too late. Dinner continued with dessert, a chocolate mousse with fresh raspberries, followed by coffee and cognac for those who wished. The room was more relaxed now, conversations louder, laughter punctuating the perfumed air. Amber had returned and resumed her position glued to Patrick, who now seemed to have regained his initial confidence, chatting animatedly with the executive beside him. Finally, the lights dimmed partially, and a spotlight illuminated the stage. The master of ceremonies returned, accompanied by a gray-haired woman Valerie recognized as the president of the Chicago Chamber of Commerce. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at the moment we've all been waiting for. The Executive of the Year Award, recognizing exceptional leadership, strategic vision, and significant contribution to the economic growth of our city." A video began to play on the screens, showing Quantum Dynamics' successes under Patrick's leadership. Growth charts, employee testimonials, images of him cutting ribbons at new facility inaugurations. It was impressive, Valerie admitted, a carefully constructed narrative of corporate success. Patrick straightened in his chair, adjusting his tie, preparing for his moment of glory. Amber squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with vicarious pride. The video ended to polite applause. The Chamber of Commerce president smiled at the audience. "And now, to introduce our honoree this evening, I'd like to call to the stage Marcus Chen, founder and chairman of the board of Quantum Dynamics." Marcus rose, buttoning his suit jacket as he walked towards the stage with the confidence of someone who had commanded boardrooms for decades. Patrick applauded along with everyone else, his smile wide and genuine. Valerie placed her hands carefully in her lap and waited. The board was set. The pieces had moved into their final positions. Now, finally, the game would reach its inevitable conclusion. Marcus Chen adjusted the microphone at the podium, his eyes sweeping the silent hall with the quiet authority of someone who had built an empire from nothing. The spotlight enveloped him as the screens behind him displayed the Quantum Dynamics logo in slow rotation. 300 pairs of eyes awaited his words, cognac glasses suspended in the air, conversations halted. Patrick Morrison smiled broadly from the head table, his posture relaxed, one hand resting casually over Amber's. "Good evening, everyone," Marcus began, his voice clear through the loudspeakers. "It is an honor to be here celebrating not only the successes of quantum dynamics, but also recognizing those who have contributed to our extraordinary journey." Polite applause. Patrick nodded modestly to a few acquaintances at nearby tables, as if to say, "No need, no need," though clearly delighting in the attention. "When I founded this company 15 years ago," Marcus continued, "I had a simple vision: to create technology that improved lives while upholding the highest standards of corporate integrity. Not just profits, but purpose. Not just growth, but responsibility." Valerie watched Patrick, noticing how he continued to smile, completely oblivious to the deliberately cautious tone of Marcus's words. Amber whispered something in his ear, probably imagining how she would look beside him during the award photos. 3 years ago, we brought in Patrick Morrison as CEO, trusting him to expand our operations and elevate quantum dynamics to new heights. And in many respects, that trust was rewarded. Our numbers are impressive. Our market presence has grown exponentially. Marcus paused, letting the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable. But numbers alone never tell the whole story, do they? Some murmurs began to circulate through the room. The tone had subtly shifted, something in Marcus's body language signaling that this would not be a conventional awards speech. Patrick finally seemed to catch the change, his smile diminishing a fraction, eyes narrowing slightly. "You see," Marcus continued, walking slowly across the stage, "true leadership is not measured merely by spreadsheets and quarterly projections. It is measured by character, by how we treat the resources entrusted to us, by whether we place the company's interests above our own desires." The discomfort in the room was palpable now. Executives exchanged confused glances. Patrick had straightened completely in his chair, his hand releasing Amber's to grip the arm of the chair. Valerie could see the tense line of his jaw even from a distance. "This afternoon," Marcus said, his voice taking on a steely quality, "I received disturbing information regarding systematic misconduct within our organization. Misuse of corporate funds, nepotism, flagrant violations of our ethics and governance policies." The silence was now absolute. Not the clinking of cutlery, nor whispered conversations. Just 300 people collectively holding their breath. For months, quantum dynamics resources were diverted for personal expenses. Lavish dinners charged as business meetings that never happened. Private trips classified as business development. An apartment worth $8,000 monthly, paid for through an obscure subsidiary. Patrick was on his feet now, his face turning from confused to bright red. "Marcus, what the hell are you doing?" Amber clutched his arm, her eyes wide, finally understanding that something was terribly wrong. People at surrounding tables began to turn, watching the drama unfold at the head table. Marcus ignored the interruption, his attention turning to the screens behind him. With a gesture, the Quantum Dynamics logo image vanished, replaced by a detailed spreadsheet. Rows and rows of transactions highlighted in red, dates, amounts, descriptions. Here we have Patrick Morrison's corporate card expenses over the past 18 months. Note particularly the entries for March 23rd, April 15th, June 8th. Dinners at Alinea, at Girl and the Goat, at Oriole, all reported as meetings with potential investors. Another image replaced the first. Screenshots of social media posts, Amber in stunning dresses, expensive wine glasses, artfully arranged dishes. The dates corresponded perfectly with the corporate transactions. Curious how these business meetings coincide exactly with romantic dinners documented on the social media of Ms. Castellano, present here tonight. All heads turned to the head table. Amber had gone waxen white, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Patrick was leaning on the table, his knuckles pale. "Marcus, you don't understand the full situation," Patrick began, his voice too loud for the silent hall. "Oh, I understand perfectly." Marcus crossed his arms, his relaxed posture in stark contrast to Patrick's tension. "I understand that you hired your mistress as a marketing consultant at an annual salary of $200,000, despite her having no relevant qualifications and never having delivered a single documentable project." The next image showed Amber's employment contract, each generous clause highlighted. Patrick's signature clear at the bottom. "I understand that you used company funds to rent a luxury apartment where she resides, classifying it as satellite office space in our accounting books." Photos of the apartment now, clearly extracted from Amber's social media posts. Elegant furniture, modern art on the walls, stunning city views. Nothing remotely resembling office space. Patrick was moving now, trying to get to the stage, but two company security guards materialized discreetly in his path. Not touching him, just positioned, their presences clear suggestions that he should remain where he was. "This is absurd!" Patrick shouted, his composure finally crumbling completely. "You are publicly humiliating me based on what? Some coincidences? Circumstantial evidence?" Marcus finally looked directly at him, and there was something almost like pity in his eyes. "Patrick, I have 53 pages of documentation compiled over 4 months by our lead corporate attorney. Every transaction tracked, every policy violated specifically cited, every federal regulation transgressed meticulously documented." He gestured in Valerie's direction, and suddenly all eyes in the hall were on her. She remained seated calmly, her hands still crossed in her lap, her expression professionally neutral. But when Patrick followed Marcus's gesture and his eyes met hers across the table, she saw the exact moment that total comprehension hit him. "You," he whispered, though in the absolute silence of the hall the sound carried. "You made this happen." Valerie held his gaze without blinking. "I did my job. I protected my client's interests. Something you swore to do when you accepted the position of CEO." "Your client?" Patrick laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "I'm your husband. And Quantum Dynamics is my client." Valerie rose slowly, her posture elegant and controlled. "When I discovered irregularities in the company's financial reports, I had a fiduciary duty to investigate and report. The law makes no exceptions based on personal relationships." Amber finally found her voice, sharp and defensive. "He loves me. We're together. You're just a bitter wife who can't accept that he chose me." Marcus turned to her with an expression of clinical interest. "Ms. Castellano, you have been employed by Quantum Dynamics for 18 months. During that time, can you tell me what exactly your contribution to our marketing strategy has been? Amber opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I brought fresh perspectives, insights into younger demographics, strategic consulting on. Cite a specific project, a single report you produced, a campaign you developed. Silence. Amber looked at Patrick desperately, but he was still fixated on Valerie, his expression a mixture of anger, betrayal, and something that could be fear. That's what I thought. Marcus turned back to the audience, his voice regaining its formal tone. The integrity of this company is non-negotiable. When I discovered that corporate resources were being systematically diverted for personal gain, I had only one responsible choice. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Effective immediately, Patrick Morrison is removed from the position of CEO of Quantum Dynamics. His association with the company is terminated. The Legal and Human Resources departments will be in contact regarding exit procedures and potential legal action. The hall erupted. Urgent conversations, people standing up, phones being pulled out. Reporters from trade publications present rushed for the exits, clearly calling their newsrooms. The scandal would be front-page news in every Chicago business journal by morning. Patrick stood in the midst of the chaos, looking genuinely shocked, as if even after everything he couldn't believe this was actually happening. Amber had begun to cry, mascara streaking in black lines down her carefully contoured cheeks, the red dress that was meant to mark her triumph now only making her more visible in her humiliation. The security guards approached, polite but firm. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Castellano, we need to ask you to leave the premises." Patrick looked at them as if he didn't understand the language. "Leave? This is my event. My award. Not anymore." Marcus descended from the stage, his expression implacable. "You held a position of trust and systematically abused it. The consequences are your own making." As the security guards began to escort Patrick and Amber toward the exit, she turned back, her eyes meeting Valerie's across the crowd. There was hatred there, yes, but also something more. Recognition, perhaps. The understanding that she had completely underestimated the woman she had spent months tormenting. Valerie watched them disappear through the double doors of the hall, their figures finally swallowed by the corridor beyond. The noise around her was deafening. Executives speculating, investors demanding explanations, press officers trying to control damage. But through it all, she remained in a bubble of absolute calm. Marcus returned to the head table, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" Valerie picked up her purse, checking her reflection discreetly in her compact mirror. Makeup intact, no sign of tension on her carefully composed face. "Perfectly fine. What happens now?" She closed her purse with a soft click. "Now? Now I go home, take a hot bath, and for the first time in 2 years, sleep in peace." She looked at Marcus with a small smile. "And tomorrow, I start looking for a good divorce lawyer." The following morning arrived with relentless clarity. Valerie woke at 6, as she always did, but for the first time in years the house was completely silent. There were no sounds of Patrick hurriedly getting ready, no aroma of his espresso that he prepared before rushing off to morning meetings. Just the quiet emptiness of a space that finally belonged only to her. She remained in bed for a few minutes, gazing at the high ceiling of the master bedroom, processing the events of the previous night. Patrick's expression when the truth hit him. Amber's complete breakdown as the security guards escorted them out. The ballroom exploding in speculation and scandal. Everything had happened exactly as she had planned, each piece falling into place with surgical precision. But now, in the morning silence, Valerie expected to feel something beyond the cold calm that had sustained her for the past few months. Triumph, perhaps. Satisfaction. Relief. Instead, there was only a profound stillness, as if a storm that had raged within her for so long had finally dissipated, leaving only clear sky. Her phone was on the bedside table, deliberately silenced overnight. When she picked it up, the screen lit up, showing 53 missed notifications, messages from colleagues, calls from reporters, emails from clients curious about her connection to the scandal that already dominated Chicago's business headlines. The Chicago Tribune led with, "Quantum Dynamics CEO publicly fired for misconduct." The Business Journal was more direct. "Patrick Morrison escorted from awards event after fraud revelations." And the Chicago Sun-Times, always seeking the most sensational angle. "Executive of the Year becomes executive of scandal. Lawyer wife orchestrates spectacular fall." Valerie scrolled through the headlines with professional detachment. Her name appeared in some articles, identified as the lawyer who uncovered the irregularities, but the details of her personal relationship with Patrick had not yet fully leaked. It would come in time, she knew. Chicago was a big city, but elite business circles were small, and gossip traveled faster than contracts. Among the notifications, there was a message from an unknown number, sent at 3 in the morning. "You destroyed everything. I hope it's worth living alone and bitter for the rest of your life." Amber, presumably, though the number was different. Valerie deleted the message without replying. There was nothing more to say to that woman. The game was over, and Amber had finally understood that she had never been the player she imagined herself to be. Just a piece on someone else's board. From Patrick, curiously, nothing. No calls, no messages, no attempt at contact. Valerie didn't know if he was too shocked to process, planning some retaliation, or simply fleeing as he always did when confronted with the consequences of his actions. She rose, took a long, hot shower, and dressed with her usual meticulous care. Dark gray suit, white silk blouse, mid-heel shoes, professional armor to face what promised to be a challenging day. Because though the revenge was complete, life went on, and there was work to do. The office was an option, but Valerie decided to work from home. Not out of cowardice, but strategy. To let the dust settle a bit before facing the inevitable curious glances and veiled questions from colleagues. She set up her laptop at the kitchen table, made strong coffee, and began responding to emails with the efficiency that had made her one of the best in her field. Ruth called at precisely 9. "I saw the news. Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine." "There are reporters trying to book interviews. The PR people are freaking out a bit, wanting to control the narrative before anyone makes deeper connections between you and Patrick." Valerie took a sip of coffee, considering. Issue a standard statement. "Ms. Morrison discovered irregularities during the normal course of corporate legal advice and had a fiduciary duty to report to the board of directors. Any additional questions should be directed to Quantum Dynamics Legal Department. And Ruth, use Ms. Morrison for now. Soon, it will just be Valerie Klein again." There was a loaded pause on the other end. "You're going back to your maiden name. No reason to keep carrying his, is there?" Ruth agreed, and Valerie could hear the smile in her voice. "I'll prepare the documents. And Valerie, I'm proud of you. What you did required a strength that few people have." After they hung up, Valerie allowed herself a moment of gratitude for Ruth's loyalty, for the secretary's constant presence during the difficult months when each day felt like a battle to maintain composure. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed focus on the practical tasks that demanded attention. She was reviewing contracts when the doorbell rang at 11. Valerie hesitated, considering ignoring it, but something propelled her to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a woman she didn't immediately recognize. Brown hair tied back in a ponytail, no makeup, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt. It was only when the woman looked directly at the camera that Valerie realized. Amber, but a completely different version of last night's glamorous creature. Stripped of her carefully constructed costume, she looked younger, more vulnerable, almost unrecognizable. Valerie opened the door, but kept her hand on the knob, ready to close it if necessary. "Amber, I know you don't want to see me." The young woman's voice was hoarse, as if she had cried all night. "But I need to understand." "Understand what?" "How you did it. How you did all this without us realizing. Patrick is destroyed, completely in pieces. And I—" She swallowed hard. "I've lost everything. My job, my apartment. He's already said he can't see me anymore because he needs to focus on saving his reputation." Valerie leaned against the door frame, crossing her arms. "And what did you expect exactly? That he would stand by you after your actions cost him his career?" "He said he loved me." Tears began to stream down Amber's face. "Said he'd leave you, that we'd build a life together." "Patrick says many things. The question is what he actually does when confronted with real consequences." Amber wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "You planned all this. Months of compiling evidence, waiting for the perfect moment. It's scary, actually. How cold you are." "Cold?" Valerie felt a spark of anger penetrating her calm. "You spent months sending provocative photos to my phone, openly mocking my marriage, using gifts that were mine while sleeping with my husband in my own bed. And I'm cold for finally responding? But you destroyed us." "No." Valerie straightened, her voice taking on the tone she used in courtrooms. "You destroyed yourselves. Every decision you made, every line you crossed, every rule you ignored. I simply documented and reported. The consequences are your own making." Amber remained there, looking smaller somehow, as if the weight of reality had finally caught up to her. "What do I do now?" "I don't know, Amber. And frankly, it's not my responsibility to find out." Valerie began to close the door, then hesitated. "But if you want some advice? Learn from this. Understand that actions have consequences. And next time you're interested in a married man, remember that the wife you're mocking might be far more formidable than you imagine." She closed the door gently but firmly, turning the key. Through the wood, she heard Amber remain there for a few moments before finally walking away, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Valerie returned to the kitchen, but found she could no longer focus on the contracts. Amber's visit had stirred something in her, an emotion she had carefully suppressed throughout the entire process. Not pity, exactly, but perhaps a recognition of the imperfect humanity of everyone involved, including herself. Her phone rang. Marcus Chen. "Valerie, I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, I was just working from home today." "Sensible. The media is in a frenzy." He paused. "I called to check on you, but also to discuss something. The CEO position is obviously vacant. The board will meet next week to discuss succession." Valerie waited, sensing there was more. "Your name came up. You know the company intimately through your legal work. You have the board's trust, and you've demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and competence we need now." "Marcus, I'm a lawyer, not an operations executive. You are a strategist, a long-term thinker, and someone who clearly understands both the technical and human aspects of leading an organization. He hesitated. You don't have to answer now, but consider it. It would be a transition, of course. We would have a strong COO to handle daily operations, but the vision, the strategic direction, that's you. After they hung up, Valerie remained seated in silence, processing the unexpected offer. Her entire career had been built on legal advice, on being the person behind the scenes ensuring that deals were structured correctly, that companies operated within legal bounds. Leading a corporation would be something completely different. But as she considered it, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just the intellectual satisfaction of solving complex problems, but genuine excitement about future possibilities. Quantum Dynamics was a solid company with extraordinary potential. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to step out of the shadows and build something of her own. Her phone vibrated with a text message. This time, it was Patrick. We need to talk. About the house, about the divorce, about everything, please. Valerie looked at the message for a long time before replying with just 2 words. My lawyer will be in touch. Because that was the fundamental truth she had finally understood through this whole painful process. Patrick had been part of her life for 12 years, but he did not define who she was or who she could become. The scars of betrayal would remain, certainly, but scars were just evidence of wounds that had healed, and Valerie was finally ready to heal. 3 weeks had passed since that night at the Grand Marquis, and Chicago had transformed into something different for Valerie. The same streets she had walked for years, the same buildings that made up the familiar skyline. Everything seemed charged with a new energy. Or perhaps it was she who had changed, and the city simply reflected her transformation. The temporary apartment she rented in River North was smaller than the house she had shared with Patrick, but it was entirely hers. Every piece of furniture chosen by her, every painting on the walls, an expression of her own taste, not a compromise or concession. For the first time since she married, Valerie woke up in a space that genuinely felt like home. The morning brought a message from Ruth. The board votes today on the CEO position. Marcus is confident. Valerie drank her coffee watching the river through the panoramic window. The decision to accept the nomination had taken days of careful reflection. Leaving law, even temporarily, meant abandoning the professional identity she had meticulously built. But the more she considered it, the more she realized that perhaps she was ready to build something new on the solid foundations of who she already was. Her phone vibrated again. This time, a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. Valerie Morrison? The voice was feminine, soft, with a southern accent that rounded the vowels. Speaking. My name is Diana Hartwell. I'm an investigative reporter for the Tribune. I'm working on a story about corporate culture and accountability in tech companies. I'd really like to talk to you. Valerie had refused all interviews since the scandal, following her own legal instinct to maintain public silence while the details were still being processed. But something in Diana's voice made her pause. What kind of story exactly? It's not about the scandal itself, but about what happens when systems fail. How misconduct persists because people with the power to stop it choose not to see, or worse, actively ignore. Your case is interesting because you were uniquely positioned. You could have remained silent, kept your marriage, preserved the status quo, but you chose differently. Valerie walked to the window, watching boats glide down the river below. And what do you want from me? Your perspective. Not about Patrick specifically, but about the decision to act when it would have been much easier to do nothing. How many people in similar positions see irregularities and choose to turn a blind eye? What makes someone capable of choosing integrity over comfort? It was a question Valerie had asked herself repeatedly in the quiet weeks after the confrontation. Why had she acted when she could have simply left the marriage quietly, taken half the assets in the divorce, and moved on? The answer was not simple. Can I think about it? Of course. But Valerie, your story matters. Not just as personal revenge, though I understand that element was there, but as an example of accountability in environments where it rarely exists. After they hung up, Valerie remained by the window for a long time. Diana was right about one thing. The story was bigger than her failed marriage. It was about systems that allowed abuses, about corporate cultures that rewarded arrogance, about how many people knew of irregularities and chose complicit silence. The phone rang again, this time Marcus. The board voted, unanimously. If you're still interested, the position is yours. Valerie closed her eyes, feeling the weight and possibility of those words. When do I start? When you're ready. But, Valerie? There's something you should know. Patrick is trying to build a case against you. He claims you violated marital privacy by investigating him, that you had a conflict of interest as the company's lawyer. He has no legal basis. Valerie kept her voice firm, though she felt a pang of something that might be disappointment. After everything, Patrick still couldn't accept responsibility. I was acting as legal counsel for quantum dynamics. Any information I discovered was within the scope of my professional obligations. I know that. Our legal department knows that. But he's desperate, trying any narrative that makes him look like a victim instead of a perpetrator. It was so perfectly Patrick. Confronted with the consequences of his own actions, he immediately looked for someone else to blame. The woman who had loved him for 12 years had become the villain in his revised story of himself. Let him try. I have documentation of every step I took. Every investigation conducted through appropriate channels. Every discovery reported following established protocols. After the call, Valerie prepared for the day with deliberate care. Today would be her first official appearance at the Quantum Dynamics office as designated CEO, an initial meeting with department heads to begin the transition. She chose a navy blue suit, cut to convey authority without aggression, and pulled her hair back into a bun that had become her professional signature. The commute to the company's facilities in West Loop took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Valerie used the time to mentally review her objectives for the meeting, establish credibility, demonstrate understanding of operations, communicate clear expectations regarding ethics and accountability. The receptionist greeted her with professional respect when she entered the modern lobby, all glass and brushed steel. Ms. Morrison, Mr. Chen is waiting for you in the 10th floor boardroom. Valerie noted the deliberate use of her married name. Soon it would be time to transition, to once again take the name Klein that she had carried before Patrick. But one thing at a time. The elevator carried her smoothly upward, and when the doors opened, Marcus was waiting. He guided her down a hallway filled with contemporary art to a conference room with panoramic city views. 8 people sat around the table, the leaders of engineering, operations, marketing, finance, human resources, and business development. All stood when she entered, and Valerie read a range of expressions on their faces. Curiosity, certainly, some apprehension, and in a few, what could only be relief. Thank you for coming. Marcus gestured for everyone to sit. As you know, the board voted unanimously to appoint Valerie Morrison as our new CEO. She has been working as our lead corporate counsel for months and has demonstrated not only exceptional competence, but also unwavering integrity. exactly what we need at this moment. Valerie took a seat at the head of the table, aware of all eyes on her. I appreciate the board's confidence. I also recognize that this is an unusual transition. I don't have a traditional operational executive background, and I am stepping in at a challenging time for the company. Jennifer Wu, the CFO, leaned forward. With all due respect, we're all curious about how you plan to approach leadership. What can we expect in terms of management style? It was a fair question, asked without hostility. Valerie appreciated the directness, radical transparency, accountability at all levels, and an acknowledgement that I don't have all the answers. You are experts in your areas. My job is not to micromanage, but to set strategic direction, ensure alignment with core values, and create an environment where excellence can flourish without compromising integrity. David Park, the head of engineering, exchanged glances with Jennifer before speaking. Many of us knew something was wrong, small things that didn't add up, but Patrick had a way of making you feel like questioning was disloyalty. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken admissions. Valerie let it linger for a moment before responding. Systems fail when good people choose silence over discomfort. My commitment is to build a culture where concerns can be raised without fear of retaliation, where questioning is not disloyalty, but exactly what we expect from leaders at all levels. The meeting continued for 2 hours, discussing ongoing projects, operational challenges, and strategic opportunities. Valerie asked questions, took meticulous notes, and began to form a clearer picture of how the company truly functioned beyond the reports she had reviewed as legal counsel. When they finished, Marcus walked her back to the elevator. You did well. They're with you. For now. The true test will be in the coming months, when difficult decisions need to be made. In the parking lot, Valerie found her car blocked by a familiar black sedan. Patrick leaned against the hood, arms crossed, his expression a mix of anger and something harder to identify. She stopped 10 feet away, maintaining open but cautious body language. Patrick. CEO. He spat the word like an accusation. You planned this all along, didn't you? To destroy me and take my place. You destroyed yourself. I merely documented the process. He pushed himself away from the car, taking a step toward her. Valerie remained still, aware of the company security guard visible through the glass doors behind her. 12 years, Valerie. 12 years of marriage, and you throw it all away for what? Wounded pride? Because I found someone who truly understood me? No. Valerie kept her voice steady. Because you systematically stole from the company that hired you. Because you used your position to enrich your mistress. Because every time I tried to talk about the problems in our marriage, you made me feel like I was the problem. Amber made me feel alive. You made me feel like a project to be managed. The words stung, even now. But Valerie recognized them for what they were, the narrative Patrick had constructed to justify choices he knew were wrong. Perhaps we both failed each other. But you failed the company, and the employees who depended on your integrity as a leader. This goes beyond us. Patrick looked at the building behind her, his lost empire reflected in the mirrored glass. They'll see eventually that you're as calculating and cold as you accuse me of being arrogant. Perhaps. Valerie unlocked her car remotely. But at least I'll be honest about who I am. She drove away, watching him shrink in the rearview mirror until he disappeared completely. There was a finality in that moment, an acknowledgement that the man she had truly loved had vanished years ago, if he had ever truly existed, outside of her hopeful projections. Back at her apartment, Valerie found a thick envelope waiting. Divorce papers, finally. She opened them calmly, reviewing the terms with a professional eye. Patrick wasn't contesting the division of assets, just wanting to end things quickly, likely to minimize additional public exposure. She signed where necessary, her initials firm and resolute on each page. Afterward, she called Diana Hartwell. "I've changed my mind about the interview, but with one condition. It's not about revenge or personal drama. It's about systems that enable abuse and what it takes to challenge them." Diana agreed immediately, and they scheduled a meeting for the following week. As she hung up, Valerie felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just peace, but a genuine anticipation for the future being built, brick by brick, on a finally solid foundation of her own truth. The interview with Diana Hartwell was published on a rainy November afternoon, 6 weeks after the night at the Grand Marquis. Valerie was in her new office on the 22nd floor of Quantum Dynamics when Ruth entered, holding a copy of the Chicago Tribune, the feature page carefully folded. "You'll want to read this by yourself," Ruth said gently, placing the newspaper on the glass table before quietly excusing herself. The headline was simple: "The Silent Strength: How One Woman Chose Integrity Over Comfort." The accompanying photo showed Valerie in her office, not artificially posed, but captured in a genuine moment, as she reviewed documents, her expression focused and determined. Valerie read the article slowly, word by word. Diana had woven her story into a broader narrative about corporate accountability, about how many people witnessed misconduct and chose silence, because confronting it meant losing security, status, the carefully constructed life. But there was also humanity in the text, an acknowledgement that choosing to do the right thing was rarely simple or painless. She didn't pretend it was easy, Diana had written. Sitting in her office, Valerie Morrison, soon to be Klein again, speaks of the months of meticulous documentation not as triumphant revenge, but as a moral necessity that cost her marriage, her illusion of security, and the version of herself that existed before confronting truths she would rather ignore. But it also cost a company its ability to operate with impunity, a CEO his belief that rules didn't apply to him, and a corporate culture its comfort in looking the other way. Her phone began to ring almost immediately. Fellow lawyers, old clients, people she hadn't heard from in years, all wanting to express support or admiration. Valerie answered a few calls, thanked them politely, and then silenced the device. Because while she appreciated the sentiment, she also understood that the story was still hers, not theirs, and she needed to process what it meant to have her most personal journey publicly exposed. Marcus appeared at her office door late that afternoon, knocking lightly before entering. He carried his own copy of the Tribune, already marked with notes in the margins. "Did you read it?" Valerie nodded, looking out the window where the rain streamed in hypnotic patterns down the glass. Diana did justice to the story. She didn't turn me into a hero or a victim. Just human. Quantum Dynamics stock rose 3% today. Marcus sat in the chair opposite her desk. Investors responding positively to the narrative of transparency and renewed governance. Sometimes honesty is, indeed, the best business policy. Valerie smiled faintly. "That's not why I did it, you know." "I know. That's why it worked." They remained in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the city through the storm. Finally, Marcus rose to leave, but paused at the door. "Patrick called yesterday. Me directly." Valerie turned, surprised. "And?" "He wanted to know if there was any possibility of a settlement, some way to resolve the situation discreetly. Said you had unfairly ruined his reputation, that he deserved a chance to rebuild." What did you say? Marcus smiled, a rare expression that completely transformed his usually serious face. I told him that men who blame others for the consequences of their own choices rarely learn the lessons life tries to teach. And then I hung up. After he left, Valerie turned back to the window. The storm was beginning to pass, sunbeams breaking through the heavy clouds in columns of golden light that illuminated the river below. It was a metaphor too obvious for her own moment, but sometimes life offered symbolism that would be rejected as overly sentimental in fiction. Her phone, still silenced, showed a new message. This time, from a number she recognized but didn't expect to see. Amber. I saw the article. You didn't paint me as a monster. You could have. Thank you for that. Valerie looked at the message for a long time before replying. Neither of us was a monster. Just humans making imperfect choices. The reply came quickly. I'm back in Nashville, living with my mom, working in a store while I figure out what's next. It's humbling, but perhaps necessary. There was something in that admission that touched Valerie unexpectedly. Amber was finally confronting reality without the layers of undeserved privilege Patrick had provided. It was her own kind of accountability. Everyone deserves a chance to start over, Valerie typed. Use it. She didn't expect a reply, and none came. But there was a kind of closure in that brief exchange, an acknowledgement that both had been affected by the events, both would carry scars, and both had a choice about what to build from the ruins. That evening, Valerie drove to Evanston, the small town north of Chicago where she had grown up. Her parents still lived in the same red brick house where she had spent her childhood, with the same gigantic oak tree in the front yard and the same porch where she had learned to read during endless summers. Her mother, Margaret, opened the door before Valerie could ring the bell, pulling her into a hug that smelled of cinnamon and unconditional love. I read the article 3 times, Margaret said, guiding her inside where her father, Robert, sat in his favorite reading armchair, the Tribune carefully folded beside him. We're proud of you, sweetheart, Robert said, rising to hug her too. I know it wasn't easy. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table, where Valerie had done countless homework assignments, where she had announced her law school acceptance, where Patrick had asked for her blessing before proposing marriage 13 years ago. The same table, but everything different now. Are you truly okay? Her mother asked as they served homemade apple pie, the recipe she had made for Valerie's every birthday for as long as she could remember. Valerie considered the question honestly. I am. Not in the way I imagined I'd be when it all started. There's sadness for what Patrick and I lost, for the broken promises and the time I can't get back. But there's also something new. A solid ground beneath my feet that wasn't there before. Did he call you? Her father asked, his voice carefully neutral. Not directly. But I heard he's trying to rebuild, looking for positions at smaller companies. It'll probably be years before anyone hires him in a leadership role again. Margaret covered Valerie's hand with her own, calloused from years of gardening and housework. And you don't feel satisfaction in that? Honestly? Not as much as I thought I would. Mostly I feel tired and relieved that it's over. When Valerie finally drove back to the city that night, the storm had completely passed, leaving the sky clear and replete with stars rarely visible through Chicago's light pollution. She rolled down her car windows, letting the cool, damp air fill her lungs as the suburban landscape gradually gave way to the illuminated skyscrapers downtown. Her apartment greeted her with the familiar silence she had learned to appreciate rather than fear. She brewed tea, curled up on the sofa with a blanket, and allowed herself to simply exist without purpose or plan for the first time in months. No more evidence to compile, no more confrontations to orchestrate, no more masks to maintain. Just Valerie, 42 pounds lighter without the weight of a marriage that should have ended years before. Her phone vibrated one last time before she fell asleep. A message from Ruth. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Board meeting about international expansion. Do you need to review proposals tonight? Valerie smiled, typing a quick reply. Tomorrow is enough. Tonight, just living. Because that was it, finally. Not the dramatic victory Amber had imagined when she taunted with cruel photos and messages. Not the apocalyptic destruction Patrick likely feared when his transgressions were exposed. Just the simple reality of living authentically, of making decisions aligned with values instead of convenience, of building a life that didn't require masks or lies to sustain. The next morning, Valerie woke to sunlight flooding her bedroom through curtains she had forgotten to close. For a moment, she lay still, watching patterns of light dance on the ceiling, processing the strange and wonderful sensation of starting a day without fear or anticipation of the next battle. The divorce would be finalized in 3 weeks. She would reclaim her maiden name, Klein, and with it, a version of herself that had existed before Patrick Morrison entered her life in that corporate law class so many years ago. But it wouldn't be a regression, she understood. It would be an integration of all she had learned, including the painful lessons about trust, vulnerability, and the price of ignoring instincts in favor of hopes. Dressing for work. Valerie chose a cobalt blue dress she had bought and never worn because Patrick had said the color was too flashy. Today, looking in the mirror, she saw only a woman comfortable in her own skin, ready to lead not through arrogance or manipulation, but through competence and integrity that didn't require external validation. The board meeting went smoothly, with discussions about expanding quantum dynamics operations into European markets. Valerie presented detailed analyses, answered questions with quiet confidence, and observed approval on the faces around the table. She belonged there. Not because she had taken Patrick's place, but because she had built expertise and credibility that sustained her leadership regardless of how she had arrived at the position. During lunch, sitting alone at a nearby cafe overlooking Millennium Park, Valerie finally opened the mental drawer where she had kept all the good moments with Patrick. The early years when love seemed enough, when they made elaborate plans for a future that included children and travel and growing old together. It hurt to revisit those memories, to recognize that they had been real, even if unsustainable. But pain, she was learning, wasn't an enemy. It was just information. It signaled where she had invested deeply, where hopes had been planted, where growth was still possible even through broken ground. Her phone rang. Diana Hartwell. Valerie, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to say that the response to the article has been extraordinary. Hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories of choosing integrity over comfort. You've tapped into something important. After they hung up, Valerie remained seated for a while longer, watching people stroll through the park below. Families with children, couples holding hands, hurried professionals heading back to work. All living their own complex stories, facing their own moral dilemmas, making choices that would define who they became. And she was one of them now. Not a hero in a dramatic story of revenge, but simply a woman who had made a difficult choice and would live with the consequences, both painful and liberating. Valerie finished her coffee, paid the bill, and walked back to the office through the autumnal park. Golden and crimson leaves covered the paths, crunching under her steps as the November wind carried a promise of the approaching winter. Changes of season, inevitable, like the transformations that marked human lives. And for the first time in years, Valerie Morrison, soon to be Klein again, walked toward the future not with fear or apprehension, but with a quiet curiosity about who she would become now that she had finally stopped pretending to be someone she wasn't.